Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all. There were about 70 people who booked for today. And we know some don't pitch, but it's wonderful for those who are here and those who will be watching a little bit later. I just said to Celeste that this is a topic very close to my heart, and I'm excited about the conversation today. So my name is Linda Smith. I am the CEO of 50 Plus Skills, and we do these talks on a regular basis to educate. Some of them are to help you learn new skills. Some of them are around our nonprofit partners, so giving you opportunities around volunteering. But today the subject is on immigration of our children and grandchildren who are living in a different place to where we are. And that too is close to my heart, as my two both left South Africa in the same year, 20 years ago to this year. And so I know what that feels like. And I know what it feels like when you get in the taxi and you leave, and the grandchild, you've seen the grandchild for the first time. I cried all the way back to the airport. So I understand these things. 50 Plus is a community. We're a membership community where we learn, serve, and earn together. And I will do a mail afterwards with a recording of the session and a little bit more details, including Celette's details, so that you have access to being able to connect with her if that is what you need to do. So let's get going. I'm going to have a dialogue conversation with Celette, and then we will open up for questions. So you're welcome, maybe if you like, to just put your cameras off while we're doing that and make sure you're on mute. And then we can, we'll be chatting for about 20 to 30 minutes. You're welcome to also put some conversation or questions in the chat. If you think of something that you want to ask, feel free to do that as well. So immigration is more than a change of an address. It reshapes our identities and our relationships and emotional well-being. And it touches every single person who is involved. So I met Celette online. Somehow or other on Facebook one day, I came across her closed group. And of course, I was interested because I fall into her target market. And so I then engaged with her and chatted with her. Celette is a social worker who did her PhD at the University of Pretoria in her 40s. And her thesis explored emotional impact on parents left behind in the migration process. And she tells me that she learned an enormous amount, both for herself and about the people that were in her research. So welcome, Celette. It's lovely to have you here. Jane, if you can put Celette on speaker mode or spotlight mode. So my first question for you is, what inspired you to explore the emotional impact of transnational grandparenting, and why now?
Hi, Linda. First of all, welcome to everybody. It's such an honor to be here. And I think, like my children said, not everything is always about immigration, but for me, it's definitely about immigration and about the emotional aspects of immigration. And when you ask about my interest in immigration per se, it started many years ago when I worked at the oncology section at the Wilgers Hospital. And where I witnessed a recurring and a deeply moving pattern where people were, experiencing vulnerable moments because of their sicknesses and their illnesses. And then they also sit with the situation of their children being abroad. And my concern was, when should the children come back? How should we deal with this long distance bereavement? And then I also realized, but in South Africa, we don't have enough information and we don't have enough scientific research with regards to immigration per se, not on the parent and also not on the child that is immigrated. So when I wanted to start my research, it was prescribed that we should look more broadly at immigration per se and how people experience immigration in the South African context. And that's where it all started. And I think for all of you who's done research or post research studies, it takes an enormous lot of time. And then once you finish, you actually feel like saying, this is enough now. I'm never going to study. I'm never going to write anything. But then afterwards, I realized, but there are so many people involved. And with immigration, there are so many facets. It's not just the parent or the child or the grandparent. And then I realized, but the grandparent gets left behind in this whole aspect. And that's why I started looking specifically at the grandparent.
Thank you so much. Okay, so secondly, how would you describe the emotional landscape of a grandparent who's physically distant from their grandchildren?
That's a bittersweet situation. First of all, I think, it's that joy of having a grandchild, and especially if it's your first grandchild. And it's important here to note that with a grandparent, I found with my studies, we have to distinguish between the grandparent whose child was born in South Africa and the grandparent whose child was born overseas, because there's a great discrepancy between these two situations. I don't know if you can allow me a few minutes and I can just try and explain the
Sure.
difference between them. So when your grandchild gets born in South Africa, it's a different situation because you have time to bond with your grandchild. You've got a chance to, spend time and physically be with this grandchild, especially if you're living in the same town, for instance. So if you're both living in Cape Town, you're close to one another, the grandparent is there to look after the children, the grandparent is there to join in all the festivities with regards to this grandchild. But when this grandchild leaves and the parents immigrate, it's a huge loss for the parent because the whole relationship has already been formed, as opposed to when your child gets born, your grandchild gets born overseas. I've also found that one of my respondents said to me, it was extremely difficult at the airport. So when you go and greet the adult children and the grandchildren, she explained to me that they had to tear the grandchild from her. And all of us has already experienced the sadness at the airport and how difficult it is to say goodbye. So now to imagine saying goodbye to your children and to your grandchildren, and that makes it extremely difficult. But then we get to the different situation where the grandchild is born overseas, and that's a complete different situation.
Okay, and that makes a lot of sense because the bond, that's formed locally goes away versus the child born far away. Your research highlights the emotional phases around the birth of a grandchild. Is that what you've just spoken about now, or is there something else you want to say about walking through these phases?
Now, it's important to walk through these phases. When a grandchild is born in South Africa, the phases are the same, but the experience is completely different. First of all, now you're sitting with a situation where your adult child is overseas for the first time, and especially if it's your first grandchild, you hear about this birth, this new beginning, via the internet or via a cell phone. So there's never, or very seldom, that physical being there. So before the child even gets born, we are missing out. You can't attend the storties. And we all know in South Africa how important the storties is. The whole arrangement of the stortie. And lately it's with a theme. And the child, it's this whole arrangement and the presents gets done. And now you're missing out on that important aspect. So a lot of people say, but isn't it still possible to be part of it? Yes, we try, but now we're also sitting with a time zone difference. So if your child is in Australia and to find the right time to have this stalk tea via the internet is extremely difficult. So right from the beginning, you're missing out on very specific and very important aspects in the forming of this relationship with your grandchild. So everything gets done via the internet, via your child. It's as if you're never really part of that whole situation. You try and you are, sending gifts and you are trying to be there, and they'll send photographs of the sonos once they've been to the gynecologist. But it's like there's always the screen between you and your new grandchild. And then the second phase, when the grandchild gets born, this is also a change that I find lately. When with the older generation, you used to be that the grandparent went to hospital to be there with a birth. Lately, I found, and I don't know if you also found that children prefer to be with a newborn for a while before the grandparents gets in. But especially now with a grandchild being born overseas, it's difficult to be there for the birth. So again, the parent misses out on this very important aspect, and they only see the grandchild a little while after, or if they're in a financial situation to attend the birth, it's only for a short period. So they're never there for a very long period, and then they have to leave. And that's extremely hard for the grandparent, for the child, and also for the grandchild, for this whole bonding aspect. And then later on, when you have to bond with your grandchild, again, everything gets done via the internet. Everything gets done via the parent. It's never that hands-on, that situation where the grandchild can sit on your lap, where you can look after the grandchild. It's always this at a distance, in limbo, and that makes it so difficult.
Thanks. That's a great explanation of three different, mirrors of that specific scenario. So in one of your articles, I read the word ambiguous loss. It was the first time I actually had ever heard that word. What does that mean, and what does it look like, and how does it impact grandparents' identity? Or
No, this is a very important aspect of immigration per se. When I was busy with my research, I came across this article by Professor Pauline Boss. And when I read about, and this whole ambiguous loss, it felt to me for the first time, but that fits exactly with what's happening with immigration. So Professor Pauline Boss coined this term, and she explained that you get two different types of ambiguous loss. So you get the first type of ambiguous loss, where a person is physically present, but is emotionally absent. A good explanation of this is, for instance, with an Alzheimer patient. So the person is there in life, and they're physically there, but emotionally, the whole situation is changing. It feels like, it's your parent, for instance, that has Alzheimer's. Physically, it looks like your parent. It is still the parent, but emotionally, that person is not here. The whole relationship has changed, and it's difficult to actually understand this whole situation, because are you still the child, or are you now parenting this Alzheimer parent of yours? So that makes it so extremely difficult. And then the other aspect of ambiguous loss is where the patient or the person is psychologically present but physically gone. And that's what we find in extreme cases like, for instance, immigration, where the child is still part of the whole family, but physically he's not here. Physically he's totally, unreachable unless you have finance and you can go and visit. And that is also what makes it so difficult, because some people do have the finance and you can go and visit quite often, but some people do not have that ability to go and visit so often. So with the ambiguous loss, it's this yearning of being with this person, but you can't. And that's why people also don't understand it. And a lot of people say, but it's not so difficult. Your child is still alive. They're still well. They're functioning so good overseas, and it's so wonderful for them to be there. But then, what about you? And what about your whole situation? And that's why a lot of people sometimes feel stuck in their situation. They feel it's so hard to move on, to create a new life, to create a new world without the children being in here. Because with ambiguous loss, it's also about the what could have been, the what should have been. And Linda, I always say what makes it so difficult in life is this whole picture in your head of how it's supposed to be. And I think as mothers, we have this image in our head of, you're going to have children, they're going to have children, and we're going to have this happy family and happy family events. And Christmas, we're going to spend all these time together. And now all of a sudden, that picture changes. I've got a child, I've got a grandchild, but physically, they're not available. And that is what makes ambiguous loss extremely difficult to handle. One of the aspects that Pauline Boss also describes is, for instance, missing in action, or when you lose a child, say in a war situation, and you never know if that child is dead or alive, and to carry on afterwards to make peace with that, and to say, can I go on? Is it really over? Is it really is it over? And that makes it so difficult. So even with immigration, every time you come and visit, you start the whole process from scratch. I've just managed to function and to accept what's going on, and now it's a goodbye at the airport again. So it's this repetition of this ambiguity that makes it so difficult to deal with. But then I also have to mention, I had this interview on a radio talk show at one stage, and I was explaining how difficult ambiguous loss is, and that people struggle, to come to terms with it. And then an elderly lady contacted the station, and she said, "But I can't understand the problem. What is the problem? I'm happy, my children are happy, so I don't know what the whole talk's about." And I remember I was sitting there like, okay. So there are people that also don't experience this as a loss. They don't experience this as an ambiguity. They come to terms with it. They say, right, they've decided to immigrate, and that's fine for the children. It's fine for me. We'll find a new way, of making sense of the situation. So that's why it's also important for me to stress the fact that not everybody sits and cries about the immigration every day and all day. They find meaning again and they carry on again. But the minute you start talking about it, and the minute I start asking you, Linda, tell me about your children that has immigrated, obviously it changes the whole situation. For the first time, somebody is asking you about something that's very near and dear to your heart, because most people don't talk about your child that has immigrated.
I understand fully what you're saying. As I said right at the beginning, both mine left within in the same year. And at the same time, I was at a crossroads where the company I was working for was sold. And so I sat, and I had been divorced for a number of years. And so it was this triple whammy of the children gone, which would have been empty nest. And some of those empty nest scenarios are normal for all of us. But then on top of it, the loss of the job. And then, just it was, and I was turning 50. And I describe it in my talks as a deep, dark hole, a pity party, which I had for about 6 months. And then I realized that I needed to pull myself together because I had a good 25 years of good life ahead of me, and I needed to make the most of it. And that's actually how my work started at Refinement Network and 50 Plus. And so out of that came purpose, and the joy of watching my children and grandchildren really growing into who they were becoming in their own lives. And our lives are about roots and wings, but this topic is important because we do need to talk about it, but we need to also find new meaning for ourselves. And it's not always that our children would be the place where meaning is. There's so many other places we can serve as well. So can you share some of the other challenges or you want to comment quickly?
Remember, I definitely want to comment because when you describe the kind of losses that you've experienced, it's interesting that they've all got to do with ambiguity. If you look at divorce, for instance, again, it's a situation where that person is still alive. He's still physically here, but emotionally he's absent. So that's also a kind of ambiguous loss. And to carry on with that and to make peace with that, to lose your child with empty nest syndrome, again, it's an ambiguity. In your mind, you know that the child is going to leave home and you want your child to be happy and you want your child to be independent. But for you as the parent being left behind, that makes it so difficult. This whole idea of spending time, of being together. And I think what happens with immigration, the empty nest definitely happens, but it just gets more intensified by the whole aspect of distance. So when a child normally leaves the home, they can still come back and visit and you can still have that contact. But when they leave and they immigrate, it just intensifies that whole situation so much more. And that makes it so difficult to come to terms with.
Thank you for that. There must have been a lot of other things that you experienced or saw in your research. Can you share a few of those with us?
Yes, with pleasure. One of the most important aspects that I find is immigration never happens in a singular situation. It's never just about the immigrant. I think sometimes we look at immigration and you see the immigrant leaving and it's all about him and how difficult it is. And there's a lot of research about their situation and the whole honeymoon period and then adapting. So a lot of research goes into that. But if we look at the person left behind, there's hardly any research with regards to that. And what I find is with immigration, it touches the aspects of the whole family. If we look at the immigrant, as I've just discussed, it's his whole emotional well-being that gets touched. But then if we look at the siblings, for instance, and that's something that little research has been done on, it also changes the relationship between the siblings and between the siblings and the parents. I found that, say for instance, you've got two children. The one immigrates, the other one stays. So what naturally happens is the one that stays gets much more responsibility. He's now the one that's going to take care of the father and the mother that's staying behind. He's the one that's going to sort out all the practical aspects. Say, for instance, there's an illness and the family group gets formed or whatever. The person or the sibling in South Africa has to give feedback to them with regards to the parent. And I also find that it's so easy for the child that's being away to ask, but have you done this? Have you done this? Have you looked at this? And that also causes a lot of friction in these groups because the children that are here feel, but we're doing everything and you're not even here and now you're criticizing. So that also, makes it extremely difficult. And I always tell the parents as well, remember that your child that is here needs you now. And it's important to still be equally involved with all your children. Because what I find is, say for instance, the child phones home and the mother is with, the child in South Africa, everything gets put on hold because he's going to speak to that child now that's phoning from Australia. And the child is sitting here now thinking, but I'm here and still, you're speaking to the child in Australia. So I think one has to be very sensitive. How are you going to deal with the situation? So then, as I said, the siblings get involved. The grandchild gets involved. So everybody in your family system gets involved. And sometimes it also leads to a crisis in that family. For instance, a mother and father that gets divorced now after all these years, that just triggers this whole aspect of their relationship. So I just find that it's never an individual situation. It affects everybody in your family, in this family.
Right. Any other things that your research revealed?
No, yes, it's all about the communication. Sometimes I feel that people tend to blame immigration and tend to blame the bad or the relationships in a family on the immigration. But what I find is if there was a good relationship before the child immigrated, that relationship will stay healthy and will stay a good relationship because there's always been this communication. They've always discussed issues. For instance, if you look at the decision to immigrate, and that's why I always find what the relationship was like before they immigrated. And if I can explain this to you, that before immigration even happens, the child will come to the parent and say, we're thinking of immigrating, we want to get you involved, and we want to know what you think, not to get permission, but just to discuss it and to talk about it. And then the parent also has the chance to ask questions, to say, but have you got a good job? Where are you going to live? Have you thought about all these aspects? And the child can then answer that, and it's a communication and a two-way process. But what I've also found is that children sometimes do not discuss this with the parent. So the parent hears this on Facebook or through other people, and it's like a huge surprise eventually when they do find out. And I think the worst situation that I've found is a mother that stayed with a family in Cape Town. They decided to immigrate. In that whole process, they moved the mother to an old age home in Pretoria. They had a function there for her, like a goodbye function. On that function, they told her, now they're immigrating. So it was never discussed. It was never part of the communication process. And that makes it extremely hard then to deal with it. And that's why it's so important to communicate about this whole aspect, to stay in communication with one another and to keep the contact all the time.
Thank you, Celeste. That's a horrific scenario where the mother just feels like she's been left behind. I know when I moved to Cape Town 5 years ago, I stayed in a retirement village for a while, and it was just after COVID or during COVID. But I noticed in the next year that a lot of children from overseas had come home to visit when they were allowed to fly and had realized that their parents probably did need to move and were not as independent and came knocking, obviously, on the retirement doors. Has that come up a lot in your research or your work when the parent gets older and the child is far away?
Definitely. For instance, if your children immigrate when you're about 50, 60 years of age and you're still healthy, it's a completely different scenario to when you turn 70 or 80, for instance. And not just about the age, it's all about your healthy surroundings and how you are living currently. So if you're a healthy citizen, still working, still coping, it makes it so much easier when the children leaves and you can carry on with your life. And a lot of people feel at the age of 50, it's not that bad. We can still go and visit. We can still keep the contact. But then something happens and the parent gets older, or not older, but falls sick. And that complicates the whole situation. That makes it so much more difficult to handle.
Wonderful. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your services, and then I'm going to open it for questions and for people to, just share, but ask specific questions while we have your expertise right here.
What I mostly do is research. I've got a Facebook group called Worlds Apart Living in One Heart, and my absolute passion is just to find out more about immigration, to find out what is the emotional effect. For instance, at the moment, and it's not answering your question about all the services, but at the moment, I'm looking at specifically an article that Pauline Boss wrote in 1990 about how her grandmother coped with her father that has left. So you're talking about 30, 40 years ago. And my question is, what has changed in this time frame? Is it still the same? Is it different? And my conclusion at this stage is that parents still long for their children. So we've got a different type of communication system now. Yes, we can WhatsApp, we can video call, we can do all these things, but the ambiguity and the ambiguous loss still is the same. And people find the same means of dealing with the situation. And what's interesting is also that religion is still a very important aspect of this whole coping mechanism, of this whole dealing of the situation. Pauline Boss, for instance, wrote that people and women worldwide call to God when times are difficult. For instance, her grandmother also used to write, "May God be with you, and be strong." So that's my absolute passion, is to look at, so how are we dealing with it now? So then I look at the immigrant. I've got a lot of young immigrants that are struggling overseas, and then it's also easier to speak to somebody in South Africa that knows the whole situation and the whole political situation. I do speak to siblings, I do speak to the parents, but like I said, my passion is with the research. So I do a lot of scientific research, but then also to try and publicize it in magazines or in the newspaper like the Daily Maverick, which has been very good to me and published a lot of my articles. And most of my articles are on my website and on the Facebook group, so that you can also understand that in this whole situation, you are not alone. Although everybody's situation is unique, there are different scenarios that are the same. The longing is the same. Then, the missing out is the same for everybody.
Wonderful. I will put the links to Sulette's Facebook groups as well as her website when I do the mail with the recording. So I'd like to open it up for questions now. Thank you, Sulette. That was a really good summary, I think, of what the situation looks like. And I'm sure many people on the call experienced many of the things that you spoke about. So I'm happy to take calls or comments or questions from anybody. If you can use the manual hand like this if you like, or you can put it in the chat and Jane will kind of read it out for me. Or Claire, I see your hand.
Hi, yeah, it's so interesting because I'm looking at this from both points of view. I'm from the UK, and my husband and I emigrated from the UK to Malawi in 1993. We thought for 2 years. We stayed there for 10 and a half, and now we've been in South Africa for another 20 something. Um, and so I've left my parents behind. They're 90, they're still alive. I go back to visit them once or twice a year. But now, two of my children have left South Africa, one to Canada and one to the Netherlands. So I get torn seeing it from both points of view. It's interesting. Although I am grateful to say that my daughter, my eldest, who has one child, my grandson, lives here in South Africa, and we moved to be near her. We left our big Joburg house and followed the idea of many people and moved to the south coast, and we're in Sedgefield and she's in Knysna. So we do see her twice a week, and that it's wonderful to be near her and that little boy. But if the Canadian son who is now married has children, we're not going to know those children very much at all, and it will be heartbreaking in comparison.
Yeah,
It's
you
very
certainly
interesting
do
what
have
you.
an integrated family. And I think families are evolving into this kind of broader. And as you're saying, you did it years ago. It was there, but it seems more prevalent now. Sulette, you want to
Yeah.
say something?
Mm.
Linda, I want to comment here and say that that's also something that I find in my studies lately, that a lot of parents are contemplating immigration. And a lot of people want to be closer to their children. For instance, moving to Australia, but it makes, again, the finances makes it extremely difficult. But there's a lot of people thinking about immigrating, wanting to be with their children. But then my question is always, would you have stayed in there? It will be moving into their house. Would you have done it in South Africa? So I think it's also a very difficult decision to make, whether to decide to leave everything here and move to the children. I don't know how you experienced it.
Yeah, quite. Well, moving out of the big family house and downsizing, but we're 30 minutes away from her. So we're not in our daughter's house. And 30 minutes is quite a nice distance because you're not on
Yes,
top of each other. We each have
Definitely.
our own lives.
Yeah.
but we can have time together. And
But I
that
think that
we are finding is working reasonably well. Yeah.
I think there's a huge difference, like you've just said now, living with them and living, at a distance apart from them. That makes it, that is definitely a completely different scenario.
Mm. We're
Anybody
pleased
else?
we made that decision. She's since gone through, she's going through a separation at the moment. So we're near enough to give her support when she's having quite a difficult time. Yeah. Sorry, I'll shush. I'll listen to somebody else.
Juliana. Jules? Yeah, there you are.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. I don't use Zoom very much. So I've lived my whole life with this. I didn't have any grandparents living in South Africa when I was growing up. They were in Italy. And then my mother chose to do the same thing and moved to Mauritius. So my children grew up without grandparents, and their other grandmother was in England. Now, my son, I always said I'd never do that. And now my son has moved to Portugal. And I have to say, I'm really struggling. I'm struggling with, well, it's an emotional thing for me because it just feels like, how can this happen in a third generation? And you can see I get emotional. But I'm really struggling with the connection with my son and my daughter-in-law. And I think it's more difficult. So, Linda, I'd actually love to hear how you cope with that because I'm really sorry to say this, but it's really hard with a son and a daughter-in-law. And I swore that it wouldn't make a difference, but it definitely does. And I see on your Facebook posts, obviously, it's curated, and we only see the nice things, but we don't see the difficulties. Um, but it's yeah, 3 generations of separation is just horrible. And I often wonder why you didn't move to England, for example, which would have been more easy, more easy for you, or to Thailand. And following your children, I guess, is never the answer. I'm still full-time work. I can't see myself living, what if they move to Spain, or what if they go to, America? I don't, and I have a daughter here who needs me. So it's such a complex emotional thing
Yeah. And I
and
think you're
really
still
hard.
in the early days of it. How long's your son been gone?
2 years in December.
Okay, two
And so
years.
there are
And
no grandchildren yet. But
yeah,
I'm like, I just know my mother tried really hard to create a bond with my children, and she's now moved back to South Africa for the first
I
time
saw
in nearly
that.
30 years. Which has been wonderful for me to reconnect with her, and she's now trying to reconnect with the children, but she's 90.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, so I'd
yeah.
love to hear how you manage that whole
So
scenario.
both my children are on this call. Maybe I should ask them what they feel. So Bronwyn, do you want to go first? Can you unmute yourself? Just you go first then.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah. How did it feel to
Hi.
leave us behind? And how have
Um,
you coped?
I think it's interesting because I think the situation is a little bit similar to what some of the other people have said, in that when my wife and I left, it's actually 20 years now, this year in December, to the UK. And when we left, we never left with the intention of leaving forever. It was one of those situations where we felt like we would go and travel and do a couple of years, or the kind of rite of passage, I guess, as such, away from it didn't necessarily, it was never about South Africa for us, really, in that sense. And so it wasn't, we even said at the airport, I think at the time, we'll see you guys when we see you, and we'll be back in a couple of years. And that was how it sort of came about. And then life happens, and you have a nice time, and you find your feet. It took me a long time to settle away from South Africa and parents, and particularly my wife, on the other hand, her mum was from the UK, and so she came back to the UK at a similar time to when we came here. So it made it a little bit easier for her, but a little bit more difficult for me. from that perspective. So it's always been hard. I think, funnily enough, it made it a little bit easier for me in some ways when I had my own children, because life just got busy and you started to think about things from a different perspective, I suppose, as you do. But it never it's very difficult, and I must say the difficulty doesn't go away. I'm quite fortunate in that mum and dad are still quite young. So in that sense, I guess not some of my friends are in a real sandwich situation at the moment where they've got parents who are 90 and they've got children that are 10, and they're very torn between the two. So in some ways it's been easier than other situations that people have had, and we've also been very fortunate in that mum and my dad, to an extent, prioritize coming to visit us and see us, and are able to do that. So, but I must say it's not easy. It hasn't been easy, but it's something that technology, and I think the one thing that I'm very grateful for is, if I think about my aunt and uncle, so mom's brother and sister, both left in the early 90s to go and spend some time overseas. So one in Germany, Switzerland, or whatever. And I mean, I was old enough to remember then having my grand writing letters to them and literally waiting weeks before they could, talk or that kind of thing. So that was very, very difficult, I think, from that perspective. So we are fortunate to have technology. I think that makes a huge difference to us. But it's not the same. It's not the same as being there. So I think it's everyone finds a way to cope, I think, with it. And I think if you settle somewhere, that makes it a little bit easier. But and then it depends on the situation. But I would say, we've remained as close as we always are, but obviously with distance. So I think that it's definitely not simple, but it's most certainly doable. And that's with the hindsight of 20 years now, really, which is a long time. I mean, I spent 25 years by the time I left South Africa, I was 25, 45 now. So most of my adult life has really been here, in the UK. And as much as it's interesting, because as much as it's for family and that kind of thing, you also miss your home, So you make a new home, but you miss your home. But I feel like I have probably a relatively decent kind of foot in both parts, and you don't know what the future is going to bring either. So, got young teenage daughters and so on now, and we just make the most of the next while and see as much as we can of each other. So,
Thanks, Jess.
yeah.
Bronwyn, your daughter lives in Thailand, so hers is slightly different.
Yeah. Hi. Sorry, I was having a problem just getting my microphone on. Yeah, so slightly different for me. I've actually been gone for 22 years now, but I left as a single. And met someone in Thailand. And then, so I don't know that I thought too much about whether I was going to stay forever, or it wasn't a forever decision at that point, because I was still very young. I left at 21. Yeah, met someone here and got married, and didn't, when you're young and you're making those kind of decisions, you don't think too much about the future and children and grandchildren and all of those things. Or I don't know about other people, but it wasn't something that I thought too much about. It was just, this was the direction my life was taking. So I didn't consider too much of what I was leaving behind, but I know it was very difficult for the people that I did leave behind. And it was difficult for me once my children were born. And my parents were both very good coming for the birth. My mom came when my son was 6 weeks old. My dad came when he was born, and my mom came when my daughter was born. And so we had a grandparent here. They really made an effort to come, and during the early bonding stages, and then really were intentional. And I guess we're really blessed that they were able to financially come, because I know there are many, many grandparents that cannot make that journey. And for us, we were not financially able to go every year. So we were thankful that between us going and grandparents coming, at least there was some kind of physical, personal connection. We also had cousins coming over, which was helpful. For my kids grew up knowing the family because the family came to visit. And so then when we would go and visit, they didn't feel like they didn't belong. And even though we live in Thailand, they didn't feel like they belonged to the family here because the family in South Africa made such an effort via technology and visiting, and when we visited, just to really make them feel like they belonged. So to my two kids who are 17 and 16 now, my South African family is their family. My mom and dad have both made an effort to really be involved, and also, yeah, my mom has been amazing that she's been connecting with them. Whatever platform they move to, she moves there also, so she connects with them by Instagram or on TikTok, and that's been really great. And you have to really be on the ball to keep up with teenagers and what they're doing. But I think if you can connect via technology, it's a great tool. Yeah.
Thanks, Bron. I don't know what it is with my daughter. She puts on this American accent when she's talking to groups, but when she talks to me, she speaks with a South African accent. It's weird. It's from being on the stage with too many Americans in her life as a missionary. So, Shana, thanks, Bronwyn. That was helpful. Shana.
I think just before you, Shana, we've got 3 in the chat room. So okay. Susela says, what advice would you give if the children that have emigrated ask you as the parent, grandparent to also immigrate? Sulet.
It's a very difficult decision. First of all, I think the parents must, what I've also find is sometimes the parents don't have somebody that can help them with their grandchildren, especially after the grandchildren were born. I found this in more than one situation where they actually wanted the grandmother to be there to help with the grandchildren, to assist with the grandchildren. And one can understand that because it's extremely expensive to get help with children overseas. So it's also nice to have the parents there, but then also the emotional availability of a parent, because that's the only person that you can really trust with your children and say, please come and stay the night, help out with the children. So if that comes up and it's possible for the parent to go, I think one must just look at various scenarios. And I think, again, every single situation is going to be unique. It's going to depend on your financial situation. Will you be able to live on your own, even if it's on the property, but at a different section of the property, instead of staying right there with the children in their house? How's your relationship with both your children, especially with the daughter-in-law, for instance? So there's so many aspects that one has to take a look at. And I've also found that parents who do then immigrate, after a while find that it's not working out and now they want to return to South Africa. And that again causes a lot of problems. So I would say if one is looking at that whole situation, and one can even look at therapy, not therapy as such, but consultation to find out from all the different role players how they are experiencing this. What is their intention in the end? So you have to look at the whole scenario and really be very thorough in making your decision.
Great. And then we have one from Kirsten Long. I have 2 children overseas, London and Utrecht, and I'm in Joburg, and one in Joburg near us. At the moment, I'm privileged to be able to travel health and wealth-wise. But I worry about when we get older, perhaps not able or willing to fly, and then wondering how often I will be able to see those kids and grandkids. How can I prepare for this?
Oh, it's like saying, how can we prepare for life in a certain sense? I think even if you're in South Africa, something like this can happen, and where you get older to travel and to make it difficult. But I would say, as far as you can, keep the contact. As far as you can, send your messages, even if the children don't answer you or don't answer you immediately, but to definitely keep that contact, keep that relationship going. And again, when I listen to Linda's children and I listen and I see their whole situation, what's important for me there is the decision that you make to say, this has happened in my life now. How will I best deal with the situation? I cannot change the decision that the children has made, and that's also to do with ambiguity. It wasn't my decision. It wasn't the parents' decision. It was the children's decision, and I respect that. But how can I, as the parent, deal with it the best way that I can? And again, I think also to look at it one day at a time. To now wonder or worry about what's going to happen in 10 years' time is just going to make it extremely difficult. While you here now, do the best that you can. Even if we look at what Viktor Frankl said, in a difficult situation, to look at your attitude. I can't change the situation, but I can change the attitude with which I'm dealing with this.
Great, thanks. Another one from Michelle. How do you deal with sharing news, good and bad, with your child who lives alone overseas?
That's a very important question. I've found in the research that sometimes parents keep information from the children, or the children keep information from their parents. Again, it depends on the situation. And there, my advice would be to always stay the parent. Think about how you would have dealt with it when they were in South Africa, because I think a lot of people can make a drama out of everything and want to phone immediately and tell you how bad it's been. Instead of just sitting for a while, thinking about the news that you want to portray and how will it be the best way to deal with it with your children. So I think with the Instagram or with your phone, you get a message and it's so easy to want to answer this immediately, and start typing this message. And I always feel, just give it time. Just think about it before you start typing, because once it's out there, it's out there. So just be in the moment. Think how your child would relate to this message. What would be the best way to convey it? But then on the other hand, I've spoken to a lot of children now that Linda's daughter is also here. You also don't want to be kept out of everything. You want to know what's happening at home. You want to know what your mother is experiencing. But then I would just say the way that you convey the message is very important.
Right. Shauna.
So my husband and I are going overseas because my daughter is pregnant and she's having her first child and we're having our first grandchild. It's a little bit difficult because she's in America. So we don't have as much finance as we would like for yearly visits. We'll probably be around when the baby is born. My question is, and we all ourselves are families we were refugees here, but we're a family of immigrants. So we don't have an extended family in South Africa. Well, I don't. And so it's pretty much a very small family that they have a relationship with. So my question for you is, how do I handle all of this? How do I mean, it's a newborn baby at the end of December. How do I keep in contact with them? They are so busy. I feel I'm encroaching on their time when I send messages. And so I am trying to find how to find this balance between now creating a brand new relationship with someone that I'm going to meet for a couple of weeks in a very distant country. How do I do this? I am really struggling trying to find a way. And I've heard you, Linda, at least with Bronwyn and your other son, to just use the internet platforms. But it's going to be difficult for me. She's my only daughter. The other two are sons, and they are here in South Africa. So yeah, just some tips I would appreciate it.
Linda, would you like to go first, or can I give a suggestion?
No, Celeste, you go for it.
Okay. First of all, just the fact that you are thinking about it, the fact that you are analyzing it is extremely important. For me, that is the main aspect in dealing with this whole situation, because I think a lot of people don't really think about what will my acts do to my children or to my grandchildren. But the fact that you're already thinking and saying, how should I best handle this? How should I go about it? Is very important. And again, your relationship with your daughter changes with pregnancy. I don't know if Linda, all of us, you'll find it that there's a different relationship that's forming with your adult child, just as, or with your child that is pregnant. So just as much as you are wondering and stressing about how this will change, I think the same with your daughter. Because with the pregnancy, she also needs you more. She needs that wisdom that comes from you as the mother. So I think it's also a situation of discussing this. How are we going to do this? Will it be okay if I send messages? Can I send the messages, but you don't have to return them immediately? But I think to discuss that with her is extremely important.
Wonderful. Thanks,
I
Sulet.
also find it difficult that the grandmothers around me are always saying it's the best thing that can ever happen to you is to have your grandchildren. In the meantime, I'm saying, well, I'm going to be with this child for just a couple of weeks. And so I'm not going to experience that benefit. So it's been difficult. Yeah, but there you go. Thank you for the tips. Linda, I would hear anything from you as well.
Thank you.
I also want to just mention here that a lot of my grandparents have told me that the fact that they kept the contact, for instance, sing your little songs on the telephone, send your messages, read stories, the fact that they hear your voice, the fact that you're there is much more important than just communicating with them once every so often. So the frequency of your communication is extremely important to keep that bond and that contact with your grandchild.
Wonderful. It is 3 minutes to past, and I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So thank you, Celeste. I think this has been most helpful. Claire, you got your hand up, I see.
I want to throw in a very quick one on communicating with grandchildren. I'm going to put in the chat a lovely app for reading stories with them. You can both read the story, and it's really nice. I'll just put it in here.
Wonderful. Put it in there, and
Thank
I'll put
you.
it into the newsletter as well. So, Justin, did you want to say something? No. Okay, Sulet, thank you. It was such a pleasure. I think it fulfilled many questions and feelings for many people on the screen that, like many of our other vulnerable conversations we have around the world of work, this is another one that we are all more similar than we are different when it comes to the pain of this process and the joy of this process, because it is both sides. And we have to make the most of it and create the opportunities to use whatever it might be whenever we can. My motto is have children will travel, and do it as often as I can. One of the reasons why I keep working is just to pay for the air tickets, to be able to visit while I'm healthy enough to do that. So thank you, everyone. I really want to thank you for staying to the end, and Celeste, especially to you. It's been amazing. Thank you very much.
Linda, I just wanted to say one more thing and to thank you for the opportunity, but also to invite the parents that's here and feel, but I didn't have the time to put a question, or I need something more, or I need more information. Linda's got my email address, and because I'm so passionate about all the research, you are more than welcome to contact me via email. I'd love to talk to you.
I will put it all in the letter that I'll send to everybody this afternoon. Thanks, everyone.